We can learn so much from our ancestors about the evolution of consciousness, both individually and collectively, if we are just open to it. We are all connected through time and space. I recently came across some cassettes that my grandmother did for my father before she passed away. And it talked about our lineage. She talked about everything back to World War I, maybe even a little bit before, and then through their personal experience during World War II. These cassettes are absolutely fascinating. But prior to getting these cassettes, I held a story in my heart about their journey and about about the story that they experienced. And I want to share that with you now. It's something that has sat with me and has been with me for the majority of my life. So my dad grew up in, as I mentioned, in Yugoslavia. Pretty much during the middle to the end of the war. He and my grandmother were pretty much alone. My grandfather had been part of the American Serbian army, and the lines had crossed on where his allegiance had to be, but he was always enlisted, and he was out of the picture. So it was my grandmother and my father, and they sort of lived in this family compound with aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins and everybody. They all lived in this compound, and they had very successful businesses, multiple businesses, but primarily lumber was their main business. And they were, for the most part, unaffected by the war in, early on. When my dad was really young, they were unaffected, even though it was going on full force. But that wasn't always the case. They were unaffected until they were affected. And when that day came, it changed everything. So my dad was at school when his school got bombed, and he came running home, and ultimately the family lost everything. They broke apart the family, and some folks had to, some of the family had to go into concentration camps, and others into refugee camps, and it was just all broken apart. Now, we're not Jewish, so that wasn't part of the story, but this is what their experience was. So it was very complicated. It wasn't just a one and done. At one point, my dad and my grandmother were down by a river, and my dad was playing, and there was this soldier that was there, and that soldier started talking to my dad, and he asked him his name, and my dad said, "Oh, my name is Theodore." And he said, "Oh, that's a strong name. My name is Teddy. And that's a very strong name." And my grandmother saw this, and so she scooped him up really fast, and she's like, I'm so sorry. And then she ran away, and they went back to where they were living. And anyway, everybody ended up having to leave, and they came for my grandmother and some of the other people that were in the area, my grandmother and my dad, and they were saved because that soldier brought my dad and her and my grandma into a Jeep, and it was the man that had saved him, or the man that had met him down by the river. And he looks and he says, "Theodore, it's a strong name." And so they were basically saved, and they didn't have to go into the concentration camp. And ultimately, they ended up having to escape in the middle of the night, and they had to find their way up to Salzburg, Austria. It was occupied by the Americans at that time, and that was the only safe place that they could go. So it was a very long journey, months and months long, but they made their way up there. And in that process, my dad found this piece of paper, and it had a poem on there, and that poem was about a child's love for their mother. And so my grandmother took it, and she put it into this satchel with some soil from the homeland, and she wrapped it up and she tucked it away. And they made their way up to Austria, where they lived and stayed in this old bombed out hotel. It was called Hotel Europa. And that's where they reunited with my grandfather. And my aunt was ultimately conceived and born in that hotel. And it was this luxury hotel like it used to be. And they lived in the part that was still standing, and the rest was rubble. Anyway, my Tantiana, my great aunt, had already been in the United States, and she was working at that time for a Rothschild, and they were sponsored to come over to the United States. And it's a very long story, but ultimately they made their way. And my dad remembers coming over on the boat, and it was a few-week journey maybe, and he remembers seeing the Statue of Liberty over the side of the deck, and it was just very impactful for him. And they made their way to what was sort of like Ellis Island. I think they called it something different, but they all had to sign in, and I have that sign-in paper with me somewhere. But anyway, they made their way to Chicago ultimately, and that's where I grew up. So my dad, he had a paper route, and he learned to speak English through the paper and the pictures, and he really got attached to the numbers in the newspaper, and he ultimately, that became his thing, like working with numbers and stock market and trading and all of that. That it was just his thing. And he also worked at a grocery store in the morning and then after school to make some extra money, and he had to give that, to my grandmother and grandfather just because they needed it. And ultimately, he goes through school. He goes to this technical school, high school. It was for engineering, and my dad's a very smart guy. And anyway, he meets my mom, and they fall madly in love. And my dad loved my mom so deeply. He loved my mom. And anyway, they get married, and they have 2 kids, my sister and I. And, it didn't work out. So they got divorced, and my dad ultimately, he left, and we didn't really see him in life. But we were very close to my grandparents, my grandma and grandpa, and, just we were close to them. But my dad was living in Pennsylvania at the time. But we would go over there for holidays. So one Mother's Day, I was going over there, and I asked my mom to take me to the mall so I could get a little present for my grandma. And so I got her a candle, and on that candle it had a little poem, and I went over there and I handed it to her, and she just starts crying, and she's Lipskin, Lipskin. And I'm like, oh, she doesn't like it. And I was so sad. I was like so hurt. And she runs into the other room, and she comes back with that satchel, and there's that little piece of paper. And it was the same exact poem that my dad had given her in German, in English. And so later on in life, when my mom passed away, that's when my dad and I and my sister, we kind of reunited. And I went to go live with my dad for a little bit. And I was about 20. And my dad didn't know that story. So I told him this story, and we were sitting down at his dining room table, and he's like this tough, strong man, like just shows no emotion, just tough. And I tell him this story, and he just, tears start coming down, and he gets up and he goes over to this box in his cabinet, and he opens it up and pulls out that little satchel with the soil and the poem. And anyway, we're all connected. We are all connected through time and space. The energetic story that we carry is embedded deep within us. Whether we want to see it or not, it's there. I hope that you enjoyed that little story, and I will have more about all of those tapes and that whole journey that they had, because it's quite enlightening. And I hope you all have a beautiful day. I love you, and I will talk to you soon.